Hello, and welcome back to the Horizons Review. I'm here with Cody again. Uh, as a matter of housekeeping, I have had feedback from a friend's son that we need introduction music. Cody and I have indeed discussed this. I've looked through royalty free libraries before and haven't found anything. So, on the very small chance that someone out here is listening to this and is a composer and would take a fee for producing 40 seconds of intro and outro music, just let me know. But today we're here to talk about the philosophy of Heraclitus. Um, so why are we reading Heraclitus? Like, what's worthwhile here? Um, I think there is a direct connection to our previous episode on Maximus. Heraclitus is the first philosopher of the idea of logos. He's very influential on the Stoics, who then in turn had a great impact on the way that Christians express themselves philosophically in this area. The other thing is that Heraclitus is sort of worth reading just for his difficulty alone. Um, we have his words in fragments. They were originally part of an entire book. There's some debate about the nature of this book. Some early authorities say that it was in three divisions. Some scholars believe that must have been the product of a later editor. Um, I think it's very reasonable to believe that it was in three divisions, but the sayings are very gnomic, they're terse, they often exploit polysemy in various ways. Um, some of them have like this clearly chiastic structure inside them. Um, and it's not clear how much the original work would have been a uh, coherent argument either. It might have been mostly a collection of sayings. And that's why I do kind of lead towards the belief that it was in three divisions originally, because a lot of people seem, a lot of ancient commentators seem to think that there's some sort of argument in Heraclitus, which to me suggests that there was some sort of grouping of sayings. We can talk at the end about what I think one possible grouping of these divisions might have been, but I think that's sort of something to put at the end of this.
So one
Um,
what one thing I would ask is, it seems like at some point it did exist as a full text, right?
yeah,
I mean, up until the second century or so, it seems like people were
yeah,
discussing Heraclitus not as a text but as fragments, and then it was lost. Even so, in the ancient world.
yeah. It's unclear when it becomes lost. Like I would suspect, uh, Clement of Alexandria had access to a full copy. He certainly seems to be quoting it as if he had a full copy and is not just quoting quotations that he's mined from another writer. Uh, Marcus Aurelius refers to Heraclitus a number of times, but he seems general scholarly opinion is that he's mostly doing so from memory. So he's not considered a very reliable philological source for Heraclitus's original words. Uh, but it does make some sense because he was someone who remained important to a number of Stoic philosophers
Hmm.
in the Roman world. Um, but at what point the actual book became lost, I don't know. I would suspect it's probably sometime after the Neoplatonic era. Uh,
Okay.
there's a few references of Plotinus that are unique to him as a writer, uh, so on. But I don't know. I'm not an expert in this area at all. I'm just sort of guessing from what I've read from other authors in this area. Um, So, since this was your first time reading this, Cody, what were some first impressions that you had? Like, what would you say to someone who might want to read these strange sayings?
Quite strange. I had heard about Heraclitus in my PhD program from people who were philosophically informed, primarily people who were interested in the notion of a process philosophy, which is that the world is not made of objects. The objects are not the proper unit of analysis to really analyze. When you're thinking about, what is the world composed of? What's the best way to describe it? And so constantly people referring back to Heraclitus specifically for this. I think a lot of people who were influenced by phenomenology, um, and Heidegger specifically would reference him. Um, so for me, I was coming into it having known a bunch of philosophers who had uh, been acquainted with process philosophy, specifically from the Buddhist tradition, who seemed to indicate that Heraclitus was some, I don't know, countervailing force providing a similar framework. So I came in and I got a very different version of the fragments than you did, a different translation. I guess there's many of them, and it what really struck me is it was difficult for me not to uh, read preconceived notions into it. I was constantly having to refer to the footnotes to see, okay, what did people think he was replying to? What did he think was going on? Furthermore, what did subsequent philosophers, Aristotle, some of the early Christians, etc., think was happening in Heraclitus, who may have had uh, far less distance between us and him? But otherwise, I think viewing it that way, viewing the fragments as a way of thinking about it as a sounding board for certain ideas, um, trying to understand his gestalt, what was it that he was trying to get at, was really meaningful for me. But I can't presume that I came away with a really high fidelity representation of what he was on about.
No, it's difficult because there are a lot of thorny interpretive issues when you're approaching Heraclitus. Um, so there's some traditional readings. Maybe he's a philosopher of incoherence who's saying in and not in. Aristotle kind of turns him into another one of the Milesian cosmologists. That he's a material monist of some sort, where the element of fire replaces the role that water has for Thales, or at least once again that Aristotle ascribes to Thales. There's some debate among in the scholarship whether that's even Thales' position as well. Um, Something I was thinking about, I was taking a walk before we were recording this evening, and it's important to date Heraclitus. So he's writing probably in the early 5th century BC. That's about where the scholarly consensus has normally landed. Um, there are some outliers. Uh, there might be a Hegelian listening to this who insists that Heraclitus was writing after Parmenides, which
Oh,
no evidence for this other than the fact that Hegel feels like it has to be a dialectical response to Parmenides. Um, but something I thought about was that often when it comes to pre Socratic philosophy, we don't actually, our view of Greek history is so centered on the golden age of Athens that everything that precedes it almost blends into like this giant mythical past that somehow is able to encompass everything from these these philosophers to all the way back to Homer and Hesiod.
sure.
But actually, like if you think about it, well, Heraclitus, if he's writing sometime in the 490s, he's only writing about 25 years before the birth of Socrates. Like these are actually people who are very closely connected, and We often don't think about that when it comes to the pre-Socratics, I think, with the exception of Parmenides, because he does appear as a character in a Platonic dialogue.
Hmm.
Often they just sort of get thrown into an obscure past. And Heraclitus was also relatively contemporaneous to Pythagoras, who he
Right.
badmouths
Yeah, he badmouths Pythagoras.
considerably in the book. And the interpretive issues also impact, it's unavoidable in impacting how we read Heraclitus. So uh, the scholarly ordering is the Diels Kranz ordering, and it's still generally how people cite to the fragments. And that's a pretty arbitrary ordering that's based on the sources that the fragments are found in. So it's completely rational, but part of the reason for that ordering is because Diels himself believed that the book was a collection of unconnected sayings to begin with, that there was no rational order to be found in how the fragments were arranged.
So in that case, he's not even grouping them by theme, uh,
Yeah, he's just grouping them by where they came from.
by secondary chronology. Yeah.
Yeah. And so most modern interpreters like don't seem to take this view that Diels had. Like there are many attempts to try to put the fragments into some sort of order that people speculate represents Heraclitus's original intent. Um, but once again, any ordering comes with like some sort of interpretive framework for Heraclitus, and I do think there's a lot of value into trying to read the fragments in a naive way. Um, and even if you've read them plenty of times before, like I rereading for this podcast, I reread in the Greek and in a couple of translations. I tried to read naively once again, but it's very difficult for me at this point. I think I've read them too many times.
I will say, even as a naive reader, you're going to be prone to making your own reconstruction of what's going on.
Yeah.
I found myself grouping things in the latter end of the translation I have to things in the earlier end, and basically trying to chunk this in. Oh, I mean, I think he's talking about this and this, in this latter and earlier part. Um, so you
It,
can
it,
see why people have done this. Yeah.
it's especially difficult too because he's a philosophical pioneer. So a lot of his words get picked up by other philosophers, but then they get a lot of baggage from those future philosophers. We'll talk about that as we go on. Like the sense that nature or physis has in Heraclitus, I think is it's misleading if you come into it with our modern sense of that word, or you come into it with an even Aristotelian sense of that word. Um, and it is that gnomic issue in Heraclitus, like the fact that it requires so much interpretive work from the reader that makes it so easy. So there there are all these different versions of Heraclitus out there that
Yeah, and there
find.
there, there are portions that you'll read, and in its kind of I wouldn't call it dense, but in its kind of obscurantist uh, way of thought, you'll be trying to read more into it than I think sometimes a simpler explanation might be fine.
Yeah. Yeah, so one of the influential attempts to impose some sort of order to the fragments is Charles Kahn's 1979 The Art and Thought of Heraclitus. And Kahn does make a point that a lot of future scholars have picked up on. It seems it has been pretty influential, which is he takes very seriously the idea that all the literary devices and the contradictions and the elusiveness and the exploitation of polysemy in Heraclitus is actually integral to the philosophical meaning,
Okay.
um, which is both interesting, but I think this also can cause some despair if you don't read Greek. you're like, well, if it's so important to grasp the original sense of these things, how am I possibly going to make heads or tails of what is going on?
Mm.
And then I would say, like, well, I think you can also get a lot of this from English if you are willing to um, read Heraclitus in a way where you sort of try to throw the baggage of the English words off of themselves.
Sure.
Um, you can get part of the way there. You're gonna miss some things that are going on, but you're gonna get much closer. And then there's the help of modern interpreters who can guide you through these things. It's like, to me, it's like it's no more of a problem to say, like, well, how do I know the original meaning of Heraclitus if I don't read Greek, than it is like, how do I know the meaning of the Gospel of John if I don't read Greek? So what I would say is I encourage people not to despair. Um, uh, when I am going to quote from Heraclitus throughout this podcast, uh, the translation that I probably end up following the most is Khan's, and that's just because it's not that I think that his interpretation is uh, authoritative or anything like that. It's just the version that I'm most familiar with. It's the version that's most in my head. Uh, but there will be influence from other translators. Um, Sometimes I'll change a word here or there to try to make a particular point that I think is important. Probably on occasion, there are some fragments that I've tried to render into more colloquial English rather than translator ease. Uh, but this episode is going to necessitate use of some Greek words. We've had this in the past. I think this it's both unavoidable. It might be helpful for users who do have some Greek, but I also apologize for my pronunciation. I learned I first learned Greek from someone who had a very idiosyncratic pronunciation, and then I learned like the normal academic quote unquote Erasmian, and later I learned Church Greek, which is very basically the pronunciation given in modern Greek, and now my Greek pronunciation is a hopeless mess. Um, so where do we get these fragments to begin with? And we've already alluded to this. Is like they come from other writers. So many come from places we'd expect, like Plato, Aristotle, uh, the biographer Diogenes. Many also come from Christian writers, especially Clement of Alexandria, who is a figure of the second century. So Clement is an interesting figure in his own right. His status with other Christian authors has always been controversial. He used to definitely be considered a saint, but his cult was suppressed in the East in the 10th century, and in the West, I believe, in the 16th. Um,
Hmm.
and he has a very long work called the Stromata, or sometimes it's translated as the Miscellanies, which is a long work on the Christian faith, but it has this breadth and intellectual expansiveness that is really unique among early Christian writers. And a constant theme in the Stromata is that philosophy isn't just not at odds with Christianity, but he actually says early on it's how God chose to train the Greeks in righteousness. So the philosophers are kind of prophets among the Greeks, and he
Hmm.
ranks Heraclitus very highly among them. And I don't think it's inappropriate to use that language of prophet for Greek philosophers in general, and for Heraclitus in particular, because what prophet means is one who speaks for a god. And Heraclitus definitely believes that he's disclosing something divine.
Yeah.
And Socrates talks about his daemon. It's over and over again. There's not this sharp divide between what we would think of as a religious or devotional world and the philosophical world.
Yeah.
So
And people
I
people
yeah
people often have this view of to prophesy is to, see into the future, tell into the future, but that's actually secondary to what actually prophesying is, which is speaking the truth, right?
Yeah.
And so, to the extent that they spoke to truth, and in the Christian worldview, is to God, um, one would have argued, I think back then, and maybe even now, that this is prophetic in a sense. It's
Yeah.
universally true, you could say. Yeah.
And if you read Clement, you do get the impression sometimes that he might be torturing Heraclitus to fit him into a Christian box. But he's also willing to attribute to Heraclitus doctrines that are not Christian doctrines. So I don't think uh, he does as much violence to the text as sometimes some scholars uh, will casually accuse him of. But it is, I think, a warning is like, you shouldn't be forcing Heraclitus into the box of later Christian theology, and that there are other temptations as well. You can find, so you were talking about, there's the process philosophy Heraclitus, and there's a skeptic one, there's the Stoic one, which is very very old. There's a Buddhist one. There's a Hindu one. Um,
And there's a natural connection, I think, between Heraclitus and Christianity, right, via that Stoic connection as well,
yeah,
which very much informed Paul, and I think many other Christian philosophers that arose in that era. At the time, Christianity's main, philosophical sounding board, or even group that they could engage with, were the Stoics in Rome, in the Roman Empire.
yeah. And it's also worth noting, of course, the Socratic, recognition of the Oracle of Delphi, like know thyself. That's also attributed sometimes to a couple of different earlier philosophers, but that's also even uh, in uh, in Heraclitus. Like he writes at one point, he goes, "I went in search of myself."
Mm.
Um, and this I actually think is a plausible option for like one of the beginnings of the book as a whole.
Sure.
I think there's another fragment that is more compelling to me as the beginning, but I think that's probably very early.
What's the other fragment?
Uh, we'll get to that near the end, but okay, we'll talk about it. But it's the way up and the way is the way down also.
Oh, huh.
And we can talk later about why I think that is. Um, and I actually wanted to get to that because the next sort of thing I wanted to talk about is Heraclitus is very famous for these oppositions or
Yeah.
seemingly contradictory statements. So a lot of traditional interpreters just thought, hey, this guy violates the law of non-contradiction. He's a supremely like alogical philosopher who's willing to state paradoxes. But modern interpreters tend to say, no, this isn't true. Uh, and then usually they try to come up with some sort of overarching theory to fit all the opposites into. So there's this idea, well, is it about the essential unity of opposites that, if you look at these opposing things on some other level, that they're actually one unified whole? Is it
Like he says,
transformation? Yeah.
good and evil are the same, and the way up
Yeah.
is the
Is
way
it
down.
transformational equivalence equivalence where these opposites somehow one transforms into another, and that's the unity of these opposites.
As he says in one fragment, he says, cold goes to dry, dry goes to wet,
Yeah.
wet goes to dry and goes to cold, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Right?
And then
It's very
there's
transformational.
these idea of like, oh, they're all opposing significances. So this is the idea that it's all like he's saying all these things are point of view or opinions. It's it's like the fragment where he talks about asses preferring garbage.
Yeah.
Um, that these are sort of point of view things, and I understand the drive to try to find a unifying theory of oppositional statements, but none of them are very convincing to me. So
you don't find the transformational one very.
well, I think that does describe some fragments.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying. I think that actually all of these have some truth to
Oh, oh.
them. And sometimes I think multiple of these are going on in the same fragment. I think the opposition framing up opposing things against each other is a rhetorical tool that he repeats throughout the book, but has different uses that he's trying to different impact that he's trying to provoke
Yeah. Yeah,
from
I
the
could see that. Yeah. Yeah,
uh
it is a unitary system, but
yeah,
different ways of emphasizing uh,
yeah,
this process, or at least if you zoom out from a process and you try to view the whole thing as a whole, right? You're not going to take a transformational view, but you'll say, well, the fact that this thing went x to y to z to x to y to z um, makes a statement about its oppositions as well.
yeah, yeah. So to return to like that fragment, so the way up is the way down also. So the simplest version of that fragment is pretty straightforward. You take a staircase up to the second floor. When you take that staircase down from the second floor, it's the same staircase.
Yeah.
It's just a relative point of view. Um, Other people, so Charles Kahn notably takes this idea that it's about more about the cosmic destiny of the soul. He sees a doctrine of um, reincarnation or transformations of the soul through different forms, like going higher and higher, but then returning back down in Heraclitus. Um, I'm not very convinced about what his doctrine of the soul is. It's to me, it's such a thorny problem. I decided not to focus very much on it, even though it is very important because Khan notes like he's the first person that really connects this word suke or psyche to the idea of thinking.
Mm.
So our modern notion of soul in some ways is downstream of Heraclitus. If you've ever had this notion of the soul as being the ghost in the shell, like that is some distorted memory maybe of Heraclitus's Suke. But I think the way up is the way down. Like, and there's possibly other interpretations of this as well. But I also think it's a statement about his method
Mm.
and
Oh, yeah,
what's going
sure.
on in the book. So you move up to perceive what he calls the logos, which is this account that everything depends on from empirical observation. Like that's where you start. But then once you're able to perceive the account, you go back down into the world and then start to see the world again as it truly is. So those way the way up and the way down are the same. Is like they're all part of this same process of understanding.
Yeah, I could see that. So when I read that portion, I tied it in with his other fragment where he says that good and evil are the same.
Yeah,
Not to weigh too much on this issue of the soul, but I was drawn to thinking about the icon of Saint John Climacus in the Ladder, where basically, for those who don't know what this is, it's a icon I think at St. Catherine's in the Sinai Peninsula that shows a bunch of monastics or people on the way up to heaven along this ladder that has different individual rungs. And as they're getting higher in the rungs, more little devils or demons or, sins or vices are pulling them down off of the ladder. And I thought about the way up and the way down and this good and evil thing in the same way that, sort of as you said, as you get higher up, it allows you to recognize, I think, more what's going on in the lower, um, which maybe connects a little bit with some of, I don't know if you wanted to talk about this, some of his viewpoints about dreaming and awakeness.
yeah. I definitely have that in the outline of things to talk about. I think like once we get to um, the doctrine of the logos, and then later on, there's a few fragments that I want to talk about at the end that I think are particularly puzzling.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that I have the interpretation that I have of Heraclitus is like they started to make sense of these particularly puzzling
Mhm.
aspects of of the fragments to me. Uh, but sort of to conclude this idea of oppositions, uh, it's not quite an opposition, but it is has sort of the same contradictory or confounding effect to a lot of people. Is that the most famous fragment probably is the statement that one cannot step twice into the same river.
Yeah, which is oftentimes that's the process
Yeah,
philosophy. Everything flows, et cetera, et
yeah,
cetera.
Pontaré, yeah. Um, so there's another fragment where he's like, okay, as you step into the same rivers, other and still yet other waters flow.
Mhm.
Um, and I do think that that's what he's getting at there is actually the material identity of a river, or the identity of a river is actually its material non-identity.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
if the water was stagnant, it would no longer be a river. Uh, and I do think that that stands as an image uh, for a lot of what he has to say about the nature of things as such.
yeah.
Um, so it's kind of interesting. It's like we want to talk about Heraclitus as a philosopher of logos, and you'd think, okay, well, that would be sort of maybe the pinnacle of talking about him. But I actually kind of feel that that's where you need to start.
Mhm.
Um, and one thing that's going on is like he's constantly exploiting the polysemy of logos. Like it means word, it means account, it means story. It can mean the ratio or proportion of a thing. Um, we typically translate it as word, which I think is also good because word in English has a lot of ambiguity to it as
Yeah,
well. As long as you don't fall into the trap of seeing it as like word as like the lexeme
yeah,
is probably like the most common use of word in everyday English because it very rarely has that sense in Greek. Usually like at least means like some cogent unit of speech, like at least like a clause or a sentence.
yeah. Like you have to think of it as like the symbolic object, or you know, that thing denoting the meaning out of something, right?
Yeah. And he has this close connection of logos with phronesis. And
Oh, that word again.
yeah, that word again. But in this case, it doesn't mean yet what Aristotle means by it. You know, we're not in the realm of that word becoming practical wisdom.
What is Aristotle's meaning of phronesis?
It's like, I was saying, that's the practical wisdom idea. Is like we're still in the realm where it more fundamentally just means thinking.
Hmm.
And he actually says there's a one of the fragments. He says understanding is shared by all,
Mm.
and so Khan and some others have suggested that Heraclitus is proposing panpsychism here, and I think that's plausible. But I also think like there's such a close connection between these concepts of logos and understanding in Heraclitus that it could also mean something like you have the disclosure of logos, the account that is behind all the phenomenon in all things. So they might not necessarily have thought, but they disclose it or they exhibit
Yeah,
understanding to the awakened person. Um, and this is like where we get into the idea of the sleepers. And you know, Heraclitus constantly has this sense that understanding is reserved for a few. Uh, but the
yeah.
logos is
It has like it mirrors with the examined life almost.
yeah, but he says the logos is the same for everyone. and it's always there. There's just one account for everyone, and the cosmos itself is one. But he also has these fragments where he's like, well, the sleeper retreats into their private world, and there's once again you can like say, okay, there's the literal meaning of this fragment that when you're asleep, the world of your dreams is not accessible to another person. But I think the philosophical meaning of this is like actually is that we generally prefer our private vision of the world to the world as it is.
Yeah, yeah, that's how I took it. I took it as the person who's awake is, um, in some like Kantian notion, seeing the world as it is, rather than um, just taking it through in their own framework. That many people are walking around dreaming that they're not actually perceiving the world as it is. Nevertheless, they have this kind of impact on us. He has a part where he talks about how even the dreamers are influencing the world of those who are awake.
Yeah.
Um, but in a way, those who are awake are bringing it back to logos, or are really seeing it for what it is, rather than for how it works for them, or totally just disregarding what is seen. Right? They have this examined vision of the world around them that to be awake means to I don't know, in some weird um, almost Merleau-Ponty sense, to understand your relationship um, to it, but understand it itself.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's once again, like there's so logos is a divine, he calls it divine. He's like there's it's a divine account that is somehow disclosed to us in the world. And what is that? It's hard to I think grasp what that means for us without retreating either into the Stoic or the Christian doctrine.
Yeah, yeah, I
And
had a lot of difficulty with this.
I don't want to delve too deeply into Heidegger's interpretation of Heraclitus because I think like most of Heidegger's interpretations, it's highly idiosyncratic. It's very, very dense. And I think to do it any justice, it would require an entire episode at least to talk about it. But I do think there's something to, he talks about the sense of logos in Heraclitus. He calls it like this primordial gathering.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, logos isn't any sort of being or substance. It's an event by which being is disclosed to the world. And the I do think he's really onto something. In fact, I would say the biggest problem with Heidegger's version of the logos here is that he consistently downplays Heraclitus's own insistence that this is somehow divine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I think he does. There's this constant. I think there's a constant fear of Heidegger of like finding himself back in the Christian framework.
Theological, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and in that theological framework yet again. Um, so it's
It's
interesting.
really hard to avoid, though, even on the most naive reading, right? I mean,
Yeah,
he's talking about this um, logos in some way as moving all other things. At some point, to tie it back to our previous uh, discussion on Maximus, he's talking about changing. To change is to rest. It's as if something set everything in motion in some way. It seems very difficult to get outside of it.
yeah, and he I think he is a theologian. I think he does have a doctrine of what divinity is. He does have a doctrine too of what the gods are.
Mm.
He says that the logos, excuse me, yeah, he says that the cosmos was not created by men or gods. And obviously, with gods, he's probably referring to the Olympians.
Yeah,
And
sure.
sometimes interpreters go, well, this is weird. Like, Greeks didn't believe that the Olympians created the world. That's not their mythology. Uh, but I think that's actually wrong if you're looking at the elite. of Greeks in his time. I think already you had the Elysian mysteries. You already had
Yeah.
this vision of Zeus as the representative of the one god. Uh,
He explicitly states at some
yeah,
point that God is in some way this word that wills itself and wills not to be called Zeus, right? That
yeah,
it's
and he,
actually
yeah,
not Zeus.
yeah,
Yeah,
he alludes to Zeus plenty. Like I think he's already engaging in this thing where Zeus is the image of this actual creator god.
some icon
Yeah,
of whatever the word is. Yeah,
yeah, his references to storms and thunderbolts and things like this, I think they all have to be understood in the context of um, what I would call is like it's the primitive version of Greek monotheism.
which was around. A lot of people don't
Yeah.
realize this. I mean, um, I think the Acts of Apostles references some time when Paul was in one of the Greek cities, and there was a monument to the one true God,
Well, it's the
and
unknown god. Yeah,
to
this
the
is a
unknown God.
yeah,
That's right.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
This
yeah,
is yeah, this is in Athens.
yeah. And
Um,
Paul says, "Hey, I know who that guy is, by the way." Uh,
yeah, there's a really good crackpot theory about this that I don't want to go into, but you should ask me off the
no,
podcast.
you should tell us the crackpot theory.
We'll talk about it off the podcast.
Okay.
The So we have this divinely order. We have this divine order, this divine account. So how do we discover this thing? What is the way in which we access it? Um, so Heraclitus actually has an answer. He's like, philosophers must be good researchers of many things,
Mhm.
and he actually shows this preference for empirical evidence above pure mental speculation. Uh, but he has this funny warning where he says, like, well, empirical evidence is a poor guide for those with barbarian souls. And the literal meaning of this would be that he's saying those who don't speak Greek have get misled by their empirical evidence. And certainly it's very believable that a Greek would say this.
But they didn't mean it specifically to mean that you must know Greek, right?
Oh
But
well,
more so that
I
there's
think
like a
they're
wisdom to.
I think they might have some Greeks might have meant that. Whether or not Heraclitus means that, I think if we just take it, uh, Khan kind of goes there. Some other people do of like you say they actually mean the uncomprehending souls.
Mhm.
That the barbarians are those who don't understand Greek, but like in this case, like just you're using this as a way to refer to people who don't understand speech.
Yeah,
Remember
yeah.
once again, like speech is one of these senses of logos, and he's constantly connecting these things back. Uh, but then he says, but then there's another aspect. He says like, so you shouldn't listen to what I'm telling you. You should actually just attend to the logos and then agree that all things are one. And that's kind of where we have to go forward, uh, because this is, I think, one of the mysteries. It's one of the bigger oppositions in Heraclitus, is that he seems in so many ways to be the opposite of Parmenides. Like if Parmenides is the archetypal monist, like Heraclitus is out there fighting for the distinction of all things, the lack of identity,
Hmm.
um, but yet he says that all things are one.
I was going to say that sounds very monist
Yeah,
Spinozan of him to say, right?
and I think in order to get there, we have to talk about his concept of nature and his concept of the cosmos itself. Um, so first, like, what is his concept of nature? He has this line where he says, "Nature loves to hide," and I think this is the foundation for understanding what he is when he's talking about nature.
Which, I mean, we said that it's not monist, but this is kind of equivalent to what Spinoza did, right? where he said, let's try and find things which, um, in some sense, can't be described in light of other things. And then he
Yeah.
says, well, that's one thing and also everything. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think once again, like, not only do we have to not take his, when he uses nature, when he talks about phusis, like, we shouldn't load onto it later philosophical baggage. For example, the idea of nature as like this whole that describes
yeah.
the natural world or something like that concept does not exist
Oh,
yet.
okay.
He's talking about the natures of particular things.
I see.
And then there's also there's the polysemy of also phusis itself. Like, it has this sense, it means like to grow or to become, like,
Mm,
is where it's rooted. So it has these meanings like origin, growth, natural form, character,
I
appearance,
see. Yeah.
instinct. And so if you start narrowing it to our scientific or romantic concept of nature, or like the concept of nature that you find in folk metaphysics, uh, you're going to do a lot of damage
Yeah.
uh, to whatever he's talking about.
Yeah, it seems like he means, nature in almost like an adjective sense, right? Um, something's nature, something's purpose or thing that it does, or description of what it's supposed to be, right? Which is very different from saying nature's object, nature is state of the world, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So we have this eternal logos, and we have this concept of like natures belonging to things. And in the fragment that a number of commentators place at the front, and is also just randomly the first fragment in the deal's ordering as well, uh, Heraclitus says that he set out to distinguish each thing according to its nature and tell us how it is.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this idea. It's like, all right, if you attend to things and learn what their natures are, that's going to disclose this single account to you. So
Oh,
in order
interesting.
to in order to uncover this divine logos, um, you must attend to nature, which means that in some sense nature is a revelation. Um, and I do think if we were going to go back to the last episode
Yeah.
and talk about Maximus, um, the closest analog to nature, to Heraclitus's nature, is Maximus's Logoi.
Yeah, it's close
The
to its teleology. Yeah.
Yeah, except I don't think that he has. There's not really a teleological language
Yeah. Not
to
yet.
to a large degree in Heraclitus. So I don't think that's how he thinks. Like, the identity of things is fixed. Um, there is like some identity to things, uh, but I don't think how it is fixed is exactly clear.
It would be closer to what you would say in Aristotle is entelechy, right?
Yeah,
Something's unfolding in behavior, and how it responds to the world, and its kind of modal way of being, rather than saying what is its
yeah,
strict purpose in a teleological sense.
yeah. And so, like, but what does he mean by nature loves to hide? Because like the verb there is fillet. Um, so it doesn't seem like it's an intentional concealment by nature, because that sort of wouldn't make sense if like the logos is one, all people who have understanding can comprehend it. Um, this intent to be hidden wouldn't make much sense. So like maybe it means something like nature is accompanied by concealment, or nature is a friend to concealment. Though I will note there are some commentators who think that filet in this sense like actually doesn't mean love at all, that it actually is functioning just as a an is verb here,
Hmm.
and it just means nature is hidden. Uh, but I am not nearly enough of a philologist to have any opinion on that. I just sort of follow the majority on this question. Um, so we have this open question about like the metaphysical status of nature in Heraclitus. Um, and so there are several alternatives. One I've already sort of rejected because I just think that uh, it's chronologically implausible, which is that there's like one nature that belongs to the world as a whole, and it's disclosed by each apparent thing in its turn. Um, and this would be maybe lend itself with more friendliness to a process philosophy
Yeah, it's
in
striking
some
me
way.
that there's a connection here. Something you just said about philia and love, right? Which is
Yeah,
one of the primary process philosophers, at least in the last 2 centuries, was Charles Sanders Peirce, who distinguished between different kinds of evolutionary notions, and one of his was a loving
yeah,
evolutionary notion. And it's clear to me now that he didn't mean it like in this, Western loving sense, but more so in a uh, sense of purposeness um, that is quite not the same as a teleological notion.
yeah,
Um, that it is just in the nature of this thing to be the way that it is.
yeah. So then um, there's a second way of looking at the use of nature, which is nature is kind of a term of convention.
Yeah,
So nature is the way that the logos is revealed by a particular class of things or a particular individual object. So a class would be some group of things in the world that share certain characteristics. Might share a nature. Because this is like just a term of convention,
yeah.
appropriate to speak of it that
And,
way.
and this also corresponds to a process philosophy view
Yeah,
of the world, right? Which is,
and
you know,
yeah, and then there's the idea, which I also think is implausible, which is that nature refers to something metaphysically real and plural. Um, that nature is used in a sense more like a Thomist maybe
hmm
would
hmm
would talk about the nature of something. Um, and so I think the second is the most supported by the text. I think if you're naively reading Heraclitus, you're gonna come more on this idea that like nature is this term of art that we talk about as like the way in which things reveal logos, like through their becoming, like through their growth, through their character, through like the way that they are. Um,
Yeah, I think the third is the most difficult to defend
yeah,
for
but
sure.
we are dealing with scant evidence, so I don't hold to any of these interpretations very very strongly.
I
Um,
could I could see the first and the second though, at least just if you're coming in with a naive reading like me. Um, but uh, it wasn't very clear that he was saying that objects have a specific ingrown nature or something like that. More so than he was saying this is a way of more or less describing the world. Um,
yeah,
by matter of convenience or uh, by matter of maybe something more worthy of describing the way that the world, corresponds in our vision is via nature than by objects. Yeah, so I guess maybe I'm coming around to the view that he was a process philosopher.
yeah, and I do want to revisit. I said we weren't going to go into depth here on his doctrine of soul,
Mm-hmm.
but I do think there is some connection to his doctrine of soul with to his doctrine of nature. Uh, but it's unclear. Like I said, it's unclear to me exactly what his doctrine of soul is. It's clearly very important that uh, soul is a seed of understanding and of
Hmm.
thought, so that distinguishes it from nature, which is more about growth or character or appearance. Uh, but it is possible that actually soul is maybe some special nature of human beings, or it actually is human beings actually do have this extra metaphysically real thing that we
But
call soul.
he does have a peculiar line where he says that
Yeah,
souls smell in Hades, right?
yeah,
Which tells you that, you know, if he had some kind of um, you know, religious view of what the afterlife was, to take him very literally, it would be that there still is this like correspondence between the structure which human beings are made of and the structure of whatever produces something that you would call soul.
yeah,
It doesn't seem like the soul is something that's seated outside, or you know, some second object of human nature to him, but instead that it's integral to being as well.
yeah. That's why I think his doctrine of soul is so difficult,
Yeah.
because there are fragments like this which suggest. So I don't think that Heraclitus is a materialist philosopher and that he thinks that only material things exist.
No,
But
that doesn't seem right.
you could easily convince me that he has a materialist doctrine of soul
Sure.
specifically, and that would probably align more with a panpsychist interpretation of Heraclitus in general. Um, but there might actually be like this sense in which like soul is like is just a special material thing that thus has its own special nature
Hmm.
to it. Um, but yeah, there's this strange stuff about also about kind of abusing corpses, which is
Yeah, yeah.
offensive uh, to the Greek view, and that would seem to maybe even pull you away from a materialist reading,
Hmm.
because sort of like, oh, the corpse is just
Just
a
a corpse.
thing, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that you can dispose of. Um, usually comes with a less materialist version of human identity. So, like I said, to me, like that's like my biggest open question that I find very curious
Yeah.
in
And I
Heraclitus.
mean that one line about souls smelling in Hades is I was caught up on it for a long time. Um,
Yeah,
Specifically trying to figure out this question.
yeah, I do think, but like once again, we'll get to this near the end. There's some other intriguing stuff he has to say about. Actually, we can pick that up now. Um, there is this intriguing fragment preserved by Clement of Alexandria, where he says, "For man there awaits after death something which they neither hope nor think."
Hmm.
And to me, this throws into doubt the notion that Khan and some others defend, that he had a doctrine of the cyclic nature of the soul,
Hmm. Yeah.
because like this is an opinion that is known to many men already in Heraclitus's time. Like this is already an esoteric teaching that people are familiar with. So if it was something that people hoped for or thought, it would probably be something, the destiny after death would be something other than a cyclic
Something
theory.
similar to what we have now and whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think we're truly in some sort of aporia here. So like, all right, we have this divine nature of we have this divine logos that's revealed in the nature of beings in the cosmos. These beings are impermanent, but they have this intimate relationship with this eternal order and thought. Um,
Sounds like a Logoi. Yeah.
yeah, and it just makes me think maybe he just truly had no answer on this on philosophical grounds. And so there's another fragment that's preserved by Clement that I think backs this up. And I've never seen anyone else make this argument. Uh, so there's probably, if any scholar listens to this, they're probably going to say I'm an idiot. But so there's another fragment that Clement preserves where it's the unreliable escapes perception. And okay, like what the hell does that mean? First off, uh, but the context in which Clement puts that quote is very interesting to me,
Hmm.
um, because it's. I think he probably had access to the whole of Heraclitus's book, and the context in which Clement is referencing it is one in which he's talking about the afterlife. And he's associating this particular remark of Heraclitus's with the soul's immortality. And he's relating it to other philosophical discourses. It's basically in a scholia of quotes from philosophers about the immortality of the soul. Um, so, you know, I think, it's like there's something about the soul and its destiny that just escapes even the attentive viewer of the logos
Yeah.
for Heraclitus. Like there's some mystery to the destination or the fate of souls in particular. Um, there is something about soul, probably because of that capacity of thought, which makes it more like this eternal logos, that makes it different from other things in the cosmos.
Hmm.
Uh, but that's about as far as I can get. It's like soul is something other, even though it does have some relationship to nature and being some sort of disclosure of the logos, but because it participates in thought and in speech, he really gives great importance to the capacity of speech in human beings.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Uh,
found that fascinating. Right. He said if everything became smoke, then
yeah,
we would primarily perceive via the nostrils.
yeah, yeah. So I think yeah. So it's interesting to me. I think uh, Clement isn't putting that fragment because it's too weird for Clement to be forcing that meaning upon it.
Yeah.
He clearly seems to have expected his educated readers at the time to know that that was
What was its context? Yeah.
about in the context of a teaching on the nature of the soul.
Mhm.
Um, so uh, there may be some good argument that I don't know of because I'm not an expert for why this is a nonsense interpretation of this fragment. But to me, it's just like this seems to be uh, the answer that requires the least stretching is that Clement actually just did know the context for that particular quote. Um, so the next idea I wanted us to talk about is so his idea of the cosmos.
Mhm.
Uh, so he's often considered. Uh, there's some disagreement, but he's often considered the first philosopher to use cosmos in the way that we might, as meaning the whole world. And so this fragment preserved by Clement that we've alluded to before, he says the cosmos is the same for all. No god or man has made it, but it ever is and will be fire immortal, kindled in proportion and in proportion going out. Um, so what is this cosmos? So is it just the physical world? Is it even the moral order? Uh, because like before Heraclitus, like it tends to have just this meaning of order or good order or fashion or sometimes even government.
Mhm.
Uh, but for Heraclitus, it now has this sense of the whole revealed universe is like this. We could call it a world order. That's how Daniel Graham likes to translate cosmos. Um, So it seems to me that like both the ordering of the world and the moral world as well, but like, and it refers to like all that, like, and the observable universe, and then like the principles that you can observe by looking at the visible universe.
Hmm.
Um, the fire stuff is also interesting. So I don't think that there isn't a elemental theory in Heraclitus. Like I think some of what he's doing, he is following some of the Milesian cosmologists, and he is like proposing like these theories of elemental transformation and
Yeah.
how things physically work in the world. Um, it's just that like I also think that he's doing other things in each of those fragments, and the physical theory just ends up being less interesting, except from like a purely philological point of view, uh, because it's too alien from the physical theory that we hold now. Uh, I don't think it's a as physical speculation. It doesn't hold up as well as even some later thinkers that
Hmm.
we now think of as very very wrong. Um, but it's possible. So he also talks about fire as like the recompense for all things, like that all things are exchangeable for fire, and that fire, uh, all things are exchangeable for fire, and fire for all things. Um, so one interpretation here is that fire is an image of some other thing that's in his book. Maybe it's an image for logos. Maybe it's an image for nature. Maybe
I,
it's an
I
image
I read it as being the
for
image of logos in nature. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That it's
yeah,
this kind of
or yeah,
driving force. Yeah.
yeah, the image of the cosmos, and uh, but fire also, I think it's intentionally chosen. Um, One, because fire has this nature where it's always consuming something in order to exist.
Hmm.
Like it is destruction itself. And I think on his view, like on the everything flows kind of view, all things are in the process of being destroyed or passing out of it, maybe even passing out of existence.
Yeah.
Um, and so it seems to me that when you're talking about all things are exchangeable for fire, this is actually a statement about the nature of the material things which are presented to us in the cosmos.
Hmm.
Uh, if you wanted to be uh, someone who is going to do immense violence to the text, you could say, no, here he actually anticipates Einstein and
Yeah.
the
Sure. Right.
equivalence of matter and energy. Uh, so there is this funny question about like, so what does he mean by like the fire is kindled in proportion or measures? It's usually translated, and in proportion it goes out. So the Stoics, Clement of Alexandria, and more recently Charles Kahn, like all held that he thought that there was a cyclic cosmos, which is regularly destroyed and reborn over and over and over again. Um,
That doesn't seem. I mean, if you just think about his concept of proportions and equal weights upon all things, that doesn't seem to me to be the most parsimonious reading. The most parsimonious reading to me would be something along the lines of, uh, well, it would be something akin to an equilibrium or something, right?
yeah,
Um,
I tend to go to the idea that it's like once again it's about the nature of the beings that we see in the cosmos. Is that they're all being lit up and going out in equal measure. Like they're never stable. He has all these quotes
yeah, right, right.
about strife and flux. Um, so I feel like these are like roundabout ways of revealing that the things that we see in the universe, in the cosmos, are not defined by some sort of like stable, circumscribed metaphysical identity in the folk metaphysics sense, but they are processes of
Yeah.
becoming. Um, and the nature of a thing within the cosmos is the way in which it becomes within the order that is uh, the logos. Um, and I am hesitant to use that word becoming to some degree because it is
Yeah.
referencing sort of this later Neoplatonic view and like putting Heraclitus as in opposition to it. But I do think that's actually why the Neoplatonists had such a hard time reading Heraclitus is where they saw becoming as something that's unstable as being lesser than being or a degradation
Right. Yeah.
of being. He's actually just saying no, that's what beings
That's what
are.
beings are. Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
just that they are becomings.
Yeah.
And
I
he
mean,
was,
you could view it as like a thing is the sum of its activity,
yeah,
and in some way that this activity more or less balances it out.
yeah, yeah. He actually like has this other fragment um, where he says the fairest cosmos is a random heap of sweepings, and so people often do give it that normal meaning of order
Mm-hmm.
when they're translating it. Um, but that then creates this confusion where people go, they think, well, oh, order there, he must be talking about the logos or the account itself. And because you don't know that once again, he's using that word cosmos.
Right.
Um, so I think he is talking about his idea of cosmos. He is talking about this idea of world order, and that it is beautiful in its order, but it's also a random heap, and that it is in this constant state of flux. And at times, like one thing is difficult to discern from another. The more insight you have into the nature of things, it becomes
Mm-hmm.
fuzzier what the boundaries are um, between objects. Like once again, like this is where it's very easy uh, to have the quote unquote Buddhist Heraclitus,
Yeah.
where you want to go into this and you go, oh yeah, there's dependent origination here. But I don't think that's his doctrine. Uh, but you can see how someone would fit that idea onto him very easily. Um,
Yeah, I mean, we'll just take into account what to take a literal interpretation of what fire is and what it's doing. It's waning in and out. You wouldn't say, well, this proportion of space at X time is the fire and the rest is not the fire, right? It's this kind of waning and waxing thing in the world, um, rather than being any one such thing, right? It's this air of breath that's moving about in some sense.
right. Yeah. So, like I said, like there is some sort of physical doctrine of the cosmos as well. Um, but leaving that inside, like I just want to emphasize what I think is like important is that so about the idea of cosmos is that it's both the world and the ordering of it that's
It's
observable.
particular
Yeah,
ordering.
yeah.
Yeah.
And but it's also the stage upon it's both the stage upon which human beings can discern logos, and it's also the means by which they do. So we've talked about Heraclitus's view of logos, his view of nature, his view of the cosmos. Um, there's something else that's surprising to people often when they read Heraclitus for the first time. It's because he's generally like what he's popularly known for is either his aphoristic speaking or being the philosopher of flux or everything is fire guy. That he actually has a lot of ethical thought in the fragments. And I think now that we've sort of established his scheme of like what the world is, um, we can talk about his ethics. Um, and once again, his ethics is connected back to the idea of logos. I think his fundamental view of the good is expressed. There's a fragment where he says, thinking well is the
Hmm.
best excellence and wisdom. To make and speak what is true and to understand things according to their nature. That the highest good is the thing that is most like the account itself. It's to understand, to speak, to do. Um, and that's why I think like there is this connection of soul and nature in Heraclitus, because if the nature of human beings is somehow the soul and the soul is distinguished by its understanding and speaking, then it would make sense that there's this that the highest duty then of those with souls is this sort of like speaking and understanding.
And he ties that. Does he tie that explicitly into ethics and behavior and?
So not in once again not in that fragment, but there are other places where he talks about ethics and behavior, and he doesn't use ethics. He uses the word ethos, but he still uses it in the earlier sense where it's about custom or character. He doesn't use it in the later sense. So if we say that like Heraclitus has an ethics in the literal sense, where he's using that word in a way that we would understand, the answer is no. But he does have a theory of both law and justice. And I think Khan is correct to call him the beginning, the origin of natural law.
Yeah, I was going to say, if it is a case that he's saying that thinking well is akin to making and speaking to what is true, right? That would indicate that then there are certain truths by which to guide things like law
Yeah.
and human conduct.
Yeah, so like there is a like, and to speak to that use of ethos thing, like he does have this fragment that I think sometimes does mislead people who have a little bit enough Greek to be dangerous here, which is that he does say that human ethos, like human character, has no plan, no judgment, but the divine does. Which, if you're reading that as ethics, you're like, oh, he's saying that human beings have like no sort of ethical meaning or ethical rule. But instead, if you read it as like character habit,
Oh, right.
it does seem like what he's saying here is like, yeah, humans have like this shifty character. They aren't always oriented towards the good, and it's more oriented or more associated than with the other fragments about the ignorance of the many or of the sleepers than it
Yeah.
is a statement about ethics. So, anyways, what is his notion? So, what is his notion of law? Is I think the important question. Like, um, so there's this relatively long fragment, and I'm just going to give it in Khan's translation, where he says, "Speaking with understanding, they must hold fast to what is shared by all, as a city holds to its law, and even more firmly. For all human laws are nourished by a divine one. It prevails as it will and suffices for all and is more than enough." I think that's like pretty close to Khan's translation, at least. So, what is shared by all? Well, the logos is
Yeah.
what's shared by all. So, those with understanding, those with nous, you know, they must hold fast to the account as a city must to its nomos, but then like to its law. But further, all human laws have their source in some sort of divine law.
Yeah, that I think that reading of the translation makes sense, given what he's already said about those who are awake and those who are asleep. If it is the case that those who are awake are perceiving the world for what it is, right? It means we all have, the capacity in some way to be asleep, right? To be ignorant of whatever that law um, or that kind of divine telling of law is, but that those who are awake will truly understand it, right?
Yeah.
It's not something necessarily that we're all necessarily following in our habits, right? But it is something that is out there that is comprehensible to our understanding.
Yeah, and that word that's translated as divine is theou. You could say it's a godly
Mm-hmm.
law. Like it is quite literal in that sense. But then there are these confusing fragments about war and about strife and about their connection to justice. So he says, uh, he also says war is shared by all.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says that conflict, Eris, you know, goddess of strife, is justice because all things come to pass according to it. And it's a very on the face confusing fragment in the context of the rest of Heraclitus because there's really no hint of antinomianism or might makes right. Like he doesn't seem to be anticipating the sophists or something here elsewhere in the fragments, other than in these war fragments. Definitely would be anachronistic to say he's some sort of social Darwinist who thinks
Mm-hmm.
that the outcomes of conflict are good and that's just how nature works.
It,
Um,
it, it seems to me though you could take the interpretation of reading it in the same way we've talked about this equilibrium or balance setting
yeah, and this
notion.
is where con goes, and I do think this is quite right because actually the Greek word for justice that's used, the DK, like has this sense of creating a balance between
Okay.
crime and punishment.
Mm-hmm.
That it is like it is the primitive, but I also think correct notion of justice, that justice isn't somehow making the exact recompense for some harm.
Yeah.
Um, so it's pointing then to like this cosmic decay. So I would say it's like then you would say it's, well, understood properly, there's balance for all things that is unfolding in the cosmos according to the logos.
Mm-hmm.
So, and once again, it becomes very hard then to not start saying, oh, I can like start importing later theological doctrines. Is this just a doctrine of providence? Um, and I don't know, maybe, but that to me is more plausible than just the more literal readings, which do try to take him as seriously saying that war is a means of justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think like he is intentionally subverting the Greek poetic tradition, uh, where Hesiod associates conflict and strife the greatest harms of human
Mm-hmm.
life. And like I do think there's this element of intentionally being provocative. Uh
I mean, he's doing that through the whole.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, like because he's provocative throughout. So but I think the question is like, all right, well, he's obviously being provocative. Um but what is he doing? And
What
then
is he
there's
actually
another
saying? Yeah.
yeah, then there's another possibility also. So there's a number of these fragments involving this Greek word polemos, which means war or battle. And in some of them, it seems like Heraclitus is instead talking about he's talking about the cosmic principle of opposition here and change. Um, and I think this is the only way that makes sense of the fragment where he says that war is the origin of things. Um,
Mm-hmm.
So, and there are other commentators who've noted that this might be what's going on. So I'm not completely out on a limb here.
Yeah. In some way, you could, if you want to tie it back to something more primordial, right? War then is this kind of origin of movements, or this throwing out of flux, um, and the kind of balance of the world, right?
Yeah, yeah. The additional step you could take here is, okay, so if this is like this cosmic principle of opposition and change and
Yeah.
destruction, that's actually what we already have seen that all beings undergo according to their nature. And so this strife, this disorder is justice because all good law must have its source in this recognition, because justice has to be according to the nature of beings, which it has to be according to like their changing transitory nature.
Yeah, I'm becoming more convinced that he's talking more distantly about equilibrium setting and just the behavior of processes as a whole.
Yeah.
Um,
But the next thing I want to talk about though is like it's I don't think we should equate these notions of law and justice in Heraclitus. Uh, Even though there are ways in which once, especially when we talk about natural law, we often sort of bring in this baggage that these kind of should maybe be the same thing, or at least very, very tightly related, and that he refers to both of them having a divine origin.
mhm.
Rather, I think like his when he talks about law, when he talks about nomos, it also needs to have the meaning of the more common, older meaning of custom.
Right.
So it's that which is particular to a people according to their nature. Because he has this fragment where he says, "A people must fight for their nomos as they would for their city wall," and he's very well aware of the fact that laws differ between cities, uh, but the law somehow protects the city
Yeah.
as the wall as the same as the wall does. Uh, so I would say it's like the proper way to read this is each city's or each polity's law is necessary, but ideally it should reflect the justice that gets revealed when you see the cosmic order of the logos. Um, but then there's this question like, how do human beings know what justice is?
Hmm.
Um, so there's a simple answer which is like, well, um, they know it by attending to nature. They see what the nature of things is. They somehow discern some part of the logos, and they derive some notion of justice from that, and uh, derive laws from that. Uh, but there's another fragment that Clement brings up that once again I think the context that Clement puts it in is very revealing here. So he has Clement has this fragment where he says, "They would not know the name of justice if these things were not." So these things is ambiguous if you just take the fragment on its own. Um, Oftentimes people say that it's punishment,
Hmm.
but sometimes it's fear. But at the very least, it is fear. But I think it's fear as a secondary effect of something else. Because the context in which Clement puts it, it seems very likely that he seems to think that it relates to the notion of conscience. Um, that it's the effects of conscience that somehow disclose
Sure.
the notion of justice as well. Um, and there is this fear, I think, that this is anachronistic, but there are studies on the subject of conscience. And from at least as early as the 5th century, Greeks were already having this discourse about some sort of interior observer in
Mm.
addition to your actions. Like there's this observer within you who sees your actions and judges
And
them.
judges him rightly or so.
And he
Yeah.
wouldn't be so precocious that it would make it unlikely that he had some sort of similar concept. Um, because I often think that we're too willing to say that conscience is somehow a product of the Hebrew or the Christian inheritance of Western civilization. It just doesn't seem to make sense from observing people or reading anthropological
I was gonna
studies
say, yeah,
or anything that like people who don't grow up in these cultures like somehow lack completely lack this inner voice. I mean, like, maybe there's one or two controversial examples that people claim of people who lack this faculty, but
yeah,
in general, this does seem to be a universal faculty of like this inner sense. Um, Once again, like it's at least active for us towards other actions that people react to disproportionality for at a very young age.
hmm
Um, and so how that would become internalized in most people makes perfect sense. That you would then start to judge your own disproportionate acts.
yeah. It's related to theory of mind in that
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
Um, so this is what I think is going on with him as a philosopher of natural law, is that justice is perceived internally. It's also perceived by understanding the logos, by observing the cosmos, by attending to natures. And then from that, you derive laws which are appropriate to the society that you're given, to its situation, its people, its geography, etc. And in that, I do think he is anticipating some of Plato's later work
hmm
on natural
hmm
law. I think there's a strong resonance there. Um, so there's next thing on my list of things to talk about are the riddles. And but I was wondering before we got to the riddles if there was anything that you wanted to bring up or like reactions you've had to like any of this exegesis so far. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I'm mostly tying it into different historical strains. Something that's really come up is now I'm fixated on this concept of process and trending towards equilibrium and so on. This is something that you later see in the Epicureans and also in Islamic thought. Ibn Khaldun, right, particularly in his conception of war, is talking about the growth of societies is this concept of asabaya has a similar idea of there's this disordering and then restating. Other folks have talked about this in the evolution of life. Erwin Schrodinger talks about living systems as effectively consuming order to create disorder to create order in themselves. And so I think if we were to make like a high level, what is there a metaphysical sketch in here, right? It would be something like Heraclitus has this vision of the world as process, but these processes tend towards some level of balancing. And this balancing, if you view it in a static system, you might view it as this kind of rule of oppositions of up is down, down is up, right? But if you then view it on the process view, right, he's not saying necessarily that the oppositions are kind of like weights on a balance, but that it is really, all things kind of um, trending in both directions to kind of make themselves, which I find very fascinating. I find it fascinating both thinking about subsequent developments in um, Epicurus and his ideas about everything from just the movement of the cosmos to war. I see the connections there. I know he was drawing a lot on others, but also just on some of our general physical theories. Not to say that like the joke we made later that he was preceding Einstein or something like that,
yeah,
but that this notion of equilibrium, disorder, and order together uh, were there. There's almost this pseudo Taoist thing going on there.
yeah. Yeah, so now that we've sort of developed this basis, like are few, there's a couple of particularly puzzling fragments
There
that
are a ton.
I've yeah, but there are a couple I definitely want to talk about. That one of the reasons I sort of arrived at the view of Heraclitus that I have is because they kind of made sense out of these riddles that I had a hard time making sense of otherwise. Because there are these moments in Heraclitus that they don't feel like anything else, like so much as like they do like a Zen koan, and they're supposed to point to something, but like by not pointing to it. Um, so when I say that he's a philosopher of becoming, like once again, I want to make it clear, like I don't think he's responding to a Platonic or Neoplatonic doctrine of being. Um, but I do think he's working in the context of like there's a naive metaphysics which sought to establish stable fundamental realities in elements or some subset of elements, physically observable substances. Um, Even if the Elysians aren't reducing things to a single physical element, I do think that they are trying to find stable elements within the material world
Hmm.
for material identity to sort of back up the naive metaphysics of objects that we have. Um, but and I also want to note that something to distinguish him from later later thinkers is that I don't. It's not even clear to me that he didn't also assign becoming to the divine as well,
Hmm.
because there is this testimony from the philosopher Aetius that Heraclitus said that motion belonged to all things, that there was everlasting motion to everlasting things and perishable motion to the perishable things.
Hmm.
However, I think with the context of how we were talking about the soul before, the everlasting thing might be souls or those things like them that have this immortality. So there's a different motion, there's a different becoming for souls versus the becoming of normal objects in the
There,
universe.
there may be three fragments I kind of linked together, um, that I thought maybe kind of match this trend. Um, One is that I think in reference to the logos, he's saying, "How can one escape that which never sets?"
Yeah.
You know that there's this thing that's constantly moving all over things, and he says, and additionally, he says every animal is driven by blows,
Yeah.
which it doesn't seem that he's talking about animals there, but he's talking about humans and why we do things, and just more generally, why does it that anything does anything, and then finally, in change is rest.
Yeah.
I tie these things together, viewing, not to state that he was saying, the logos is some initial mover argument or something like that, but that he is saying that there is almost this driving force, um, underlying all things, and it's not something that you're going to easily get away from, or get away from at all. Like
Yeah.
even in the moment of rest, your change is driving you towards it.
Yeah. This is yeah, the that fragment in particular. So one translation of it I like is changing it
Hmm.
rest. And when you
Uh,
put that into the context of how uh, that fragment's preserved in Plotinus, and Plotinus is like, yeah, this is mysterious. Like, what could he possibly mean by this? Because for the Neoplatonists, like rest and change are very distinct metaphysical opposites.
hmm.
But I think if you adopt this view that the stable identity of things is their becoming, that their identity is defined by their nature of change, that uh, to rest for them, you know,
Yeah.
is to change. Is that so? Like we return to the river fragments, where like the unity of change and identity is very very clear. That rivers would not be rivers unless their material
Sure.
was always changing. Um, And I don't think that this applies. Like some commentators think that when he says changing at rest is applied only to the soul, uh, and thus it might be about his a theory of like a cyclic nature to the soul. Uh, but it seems to me that it's actually is about the identity of everything that's ordered by logos.
That seems right. It seems like what we were talking about earlier, right? To call something a thing is also to describe um, its flux nature, what it does.
Yeah,
Um,
and in the context in which it is given, I don't think it's clear that, for example, Plotinus thought that he was only speaking of souls there.
sure.
Um, another puzzling fragment is he says, "All we see waking is death.
Yeah,
All
I
we
couldn't
see
make heads or
sleeping
tails.
is sleep." So I think
Yeah.
there are a number of things going on here. Is that one? There's this very literal meaning, but even that's a little strange. Is that so? When we're awake, everything we see is death, but when we're asleep, all we see is sleep. So that's like just seems to be like this very bleak view. But then there's another angle where we relate it back to this notion that those who are asleep are those who do not see the logos, but they've retreated to their private world, that world of dreams, which is not shared.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, all you see sleeping is sleep. If you're asleep to the account, you're just going to see your private world. Your private world is the dream is analogous to the dream world. So what does it mean to say that uh, all we see waking is death? Because the awake person should be aware of the logos. So why does he only see death? So I think the key here is like once again, it's like these ideas of like the nature of things being war, opposition, change, decay, flux, consumption, fire. Is that once you perceive the logos, which is eternal, uh, when you look at beings, you see their decay. You see their impermanence. You see death once you're awake.
Mhm.
Um, so that's sort of like that.
Yeah, that's
That's
more straightforward reading, I think. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. That is one of the fragments that led me to really attach myself to this view,
Hmm.
uh, because otherwise it does seem very strange. Because there isn't some sort of pessimism uh, or attack on the notion of life. Like there isn't some sort of he's not a philosopher. He's not a philosopher of disgust, and there are philosophers of disgust.
Yeah.
And the uh, and you can also see why someone who wants the Buddhist Heraclitus would really attach themselves to a more literal meaning of that fragment.
I mean, could there be a reading that in sleep, all we see is really the symbolic, and not the real aspect,
Yeah,
and that when we're awake, we see things for what they truly are, and in that sense, um, this symbolic construction disappears.
yeah, yeah. That's an interesting question, and to answer, like to feel like I could answer that, I would need to know more about what was the contemporary view of dreams.
Yeah.
Uh, because I imagine it was probably like many ancient peoples, is that they saw dreams as some sort of disclosure.
Hmm.
Uh, but actually, if that's true, it's once again it's one of these areas in which Heraclitus seems to be courting controversy. Is that he associates dreaming actually with ignorance?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I'm drawing on notions of the real, right?
yeah,
That you're not going to necessarily encounter the real merely in the symbolic, but to encounter the real, as Kant would say, that that thing in itself, would almost mean like the disintegration of the symbolic, right? That things as they truly are not as things as symbols, Um, but again, instead as these kind of movements or such. Um,
Yeah, and the last fragment that I wanted to talk about is like one of these riddle fragments, sort of has the same form, which is that he has this fragment where he says, the unapparent harmony is better than the apparent. And so the apparent harmony is, I think, our naive metaphysics, that things are static, they're easily identifiable, that they're eternal in some sense, that they have consistent identity throughout time. This is the sort of view that breaks down very easily when confronted with like the ship of Theseus thought experiment. Um, but it's that nature loves to hide is the unapparent harmony.
mm-hmm.
It's that truth once you perceive logos, uh, that logos which orders all things to exist by becoming, uh, and then through their natures they shine forth a disclosure of that logos through their flux and change, and that's the unapparent harmony. And so, yeah, that's the conclusion for me about like how I've come to read these things over the years. But
Mm-hmm.
I once again want to say, like, I'm not very attached to this being an authoritative version of Heraclitus. I very well might be indulging myself in the grand philosophical tradition of taking every single author that you like and somehow harmonizing them
Yeah.
to a view which you find amenable. Uh, I never, I swear I read this once, but I've never been able to find the source again. I swear I once read this interview with Heidegger where someone's asking him this question about some lectures that he had given on Kant, and he like goes, "Yeah, they're not very good Kant, but they're very good Heidegger."
Mm.
And I think that's always a little bit of what philosophical exegesis is. Like, it is an
Yeah.
act of philosophizing itself, and if you're doing a good job, it's probably a good job of whatever you're thinking. If you were just doing the enterprise of trying to recover what that thinker was thinking simply, it would be a purely uh, philological
Yeah.
exercise. It would probably cease to be as much of a philosophical exercise.
Yeah. It wouldn't be much of a matter of discussion. I mean, that's to say the least, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so the last thing that I wanted to talk about is like, okay, so there's this question. If we accept that there originally were these three divisions in the book Heraclitus's book, what themes kind of gathered the fragments together?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think for me the key is like this idea that the way up and the way down are the same. And so I would think that there's the theory of nature and of the cosmos uh, building itself up to then the disclosure of what the logos is. So actually, the fragment that people often put at the beginning, I would then think is at the beginning of the second part, and then the way down is actually the discourse on natural law.
Mm-hmm.
It leads you back into the physical world once you've had um, the account revealed to you, and
Yeah.
then
I
back
was putting it
down.
the other way.
Yeah,
I was putting it as year two, kind of this conception of the word or logos, and then after that, a conception of general understanding, and then finally, I think my three matches year three, which is
yeah,
general metaphysical or ethical commentary.
yeah. I just think like in order for the way up and the way down to be the same, there has to be like this ascent from the cosmos to the eternal order, and then from that back down
Mm-hmm.
to the world of things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also possible that all the stuff regarding the doctrine of the soul is actually the bridge between uh, the logos and the natural law discourses. That's an
Sure.
overlapping discourse within the divisions of the book. Like that's very plausible to me. Like I've thought before as an enterprise, it might be fun to try to reorder the
Oh yeah,
fragments and
yeah. That'd be
maybe
fun.
include some of the non-fragmentary commentary from other authors about testimonies about what Heraclitus thought.
Hmm.
Um, Speaking of commentary from other authors, so there is a biography of Heraclitus and Diogenes Laertius, but generally most people think this is completely made up.
Yeah, I was gonna
It,
say
it's
what.
it's just Diogenes' attempt to provide a convenient narrative for some of the uh, myths that had grown up around Heraclitus. That he was like this recluse. He was somehow um, the descendant of the honorary kings of Ephesus, but
Oh,
had rejected his hereditary kingship to go like live off in the hills as a loner. But this like seems to be pulling from tropes about other philosophers more than it uh, seems to be a description of anything
yeah. It sounds like they're giving him like a based, like reconstructionist hagiography rather than.
right. Yeah, there's a lot of this in Diogenes, and I do think like there are tropes that people start assigning to philosophers over time, where they become more like they become more like saints. Yeah, there are these things that you want to assign to the nature. Like the philosopher makes you some being a philosopher makes you some sort of beast who's unfit for the
Yeah,
city.
this ought to be what a lover of wisdom is like. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think about it in the Christian context, sometimes about the discourses around stylites.
Oh, sure.
I sometimes wonder how much those represent any reality versus like a set of tropes that they assign to those kinds of hermits.
Yeah.
Um, that you want to make those stories as extreme as possible, that they grow in the telling. And I think a certain thing does happen with the lives of thinkers. I I think a lot uh, when I was much younger. I had a lunch one day with a guy I knew. Well, actually, I knew his wife better than I knew him, who was a PhD student at the University of Chicago.
Hmm.
And I made this remark about Leo Strauss. I was like, to me, the really off putting thing about Strauss is like not so much Strauss himself, but his cult.
Hmm.
And then this guy goes, well, every successful philosopher starts a cult. And then I thought about it and I realized, that's true.
Yeah.
Is that everyone who's actually, even if they don't have a literal set of followers that is around them in their lifetime, if you are successful at the philosophical enterprise, you develop a cult. Like Nietzsche sort of did develop one in his lifetime. It was just in a place that he didn't expect. It was Americans
Yeah.
who were really the only cult in his lifetime, but he did get one in Germany after his death. Uh, you know, Kierkegaard got a cult after death. Plenty of philosophers. If you look at every, yeah, I don't know, is there a great philosopher that you can't say
It didn't have. Yeah.
there's a cultic element around them, a worshipful attitude that a certain group of people have towards this person.
Yeah. I mean, you and I were talking about Jefferson's views on Kant, right? And it was clear that he viewed this guy in massive proportions
Yeah,
above other humans in terms of the intellectual achievement that he had gained.
yeah, we do need to talk about Kant, because like once again, there's this funny resonance, I think, to some of the things that are in his metaphysics to what's going on here. But I think in order to do that, you have to like take this very esoteric reading of Kant at times. But I don't want to go as far as Heidegger, who like Heidegger is like Kant's greatest insight is something that he didn't even realize, which is
Mm,
being is not itself a being. And
Yeah.
it's like, okay, Martin, that's what you believe, but I don't know if Kant secretly secretly had that insight but didn't express it.
I mean, the nice thing about Kant, though, is that not only do we have his public philosophical writings, but we also have his lectures,
Right.
where he would be like, "Oh yeah, so I wrote this, and actually, what I meant was this."
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we have
everyone,
lectures, yeah, we have letters, yeah. There's all sorts of this, yeah, interpretive apparatus. But I do think that's might be the next episode that we do, is that you want to talk about uh Kant's ethics.
yeah,
And I do think this is a good subject, because I do think this is an area where people have a naive view of Kant that needs to be corrected. And even some rather sophisticated people, like I would
oh
say,
yeah,
like this naive view is very, very common in areas of legal academia. I mean, like Kantianism is sort of retreated as a theoretical basis in areas like contract law or criminal law, where it used to have a lot of sway. Uh, but because that view of Kantian ethics was the view that those people were working with, like that's typically also how even very sophisticated lawyers, philosophically sophisticated lawyers, will think about
they
Kant.
end up reading him that way.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because so I think this might be a good place to leave off then. So yeah, maybe next time we'll be talking about how Kant is secretly maybe a virtue ethicist. But yeah, thanks for listening. And if you're watching on YouTube, please, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and otherwise subscribe to the Substack. I think there's a couple things I want to write about in the coming months that I'll throw up there as well. But thanks for listening, and this is the end of this episode of the Horizons Review.